some of those for you. That's the real intent. If I can get my screen shared properly here, I will get into my specific comments in that. I'm going to talk really about three things. What's happening with dental practice sales now? Are there still buyers? And the longer term question, I'm sure the biggest question in people's minds, what do we foresee happening with prices? Okay, and now I need to, there we go. As a bit of background, Tier 3's been in the practice transition, valuation and sale business since 1982. I'm so fortunate to deal with 23 of our reps across Canada, many of whom are dentists or hygienists. And that, I rely on that so much because they've got the real in-office clinical experience that so many of you are dealing with. So if you want to talk to anybody about your specific practice and situation, I know I speak for all of them when I say they'd be eager to share their perspective. Let's begin with where sales are right now. We came into COVID with 12 practices where we had a price on the table and terms on the table, either through a letter of intent or through a purchase agreement that hadn't been signed. So this is kind of instructive in terms of how the market has changed because none of these deals were signed. And there's some good case studies. We came in with 12 deals. Of those, 7 are moving forward still above the appraised price. One's that was not a very great practice going through below the appraised value. One owner's taken their practice off the market. And 3, we've just got buyers and sellers to see how things play. So the broad conclusions here are that for some practices, the price hasn't changed at all. Others, those 5 where they're moving forward but at a lower price, they were all practices where there were significant premiums factored in. Frankly, over the last 6 months, really, we saw the market leap forward another step. So while those practices have now given back some of the premium they were, they're all still currently moving ahead above appraised value. In all cases, closings are going to be contingent on the resumption of dental services. So the one caveat I'd throw on all of this is that until a deal is closed and money is in the bank, nothing is entirely certain. But the initial experience here, frankly, has been less negative than I might have thought it would. And the reason is that buyers are still very interested in practices. That chart you're looking at in front of you shows a listing we posted on March 30th, so really 2 weeks into the office closure. We've had almost 300 people inquire about it, almost 90 people request the appraisal for detailed information. 11 people are booked in to see it digitally or virtually, not in person. And I think what's going on here is there are still far too few practices for the number of buyers. There are associates out there, many on this, or potentially some on this call, who are very worried about what it's going to be like going back to work in their office in the office for their principal dentist. And some have told us they'd rather be in control of their own fate going forward. They're more interested in buying now. Others fear a drop in the number of new listings because some owners won't be able to sell them for. So the good news is that certainly buyers are more cautious. Some have definitely stepped to the sideline, but there are enough buyers out there proceeding to keep things moving forward, at least to the point that people are ready to sign the agreement. We've got more clarity on how things will play out. I also said I would talk about what we expect to happen to practice values. And while we can't be sure, we really do believe that in the long run, there's reason for confidence. The best way of thinking about the price of a dental practice, there are many ways of thinking, but what tends to drive the market is that the price of a practice is the function of the earnings, because it's only from earnings that a purchaser funds their lifestyle and is able to pay back Ramal at BMO the practice loan. So earnings times an earnings multiple. And that earnings multiple is driven by supply and demand. The more people who want to buy a practice, obviously, the more they're going to have to pay to get that. So if we can figure out what's likely to happen to earnings and what may happen to that earnings multiple, which is driven by supply and demand, we can have a reasonable sense of what may happen to prices once we're through the short and potentially midterm disruption. The good news is that history and the fundamental laws of economics can provide us some pretty good guidance. In terms of earnings, the number one component of earnings is revenue. There are a lot of questions. You see a few of them on your screen. What's the impact of the current closures? What will happen if we ramp up slowly over once offices can be open again? That's somewhat offset by a very important point that some people are missing, which is those of you who own practices have a huge treatment backlog built up in your practice. Well, maybe not all of those patients will come back immediately or can be treated immediately. The key is that unlike most businesses, dental practices have gone through revenue deferral rather to a much greater degree than revenue loss. Think of the taxi ride somebody didn't take today or the restaurant meal they didn't buy tonight. That revenue is gone forever for those businesses. But your patients still need that dental treatment, and while some of the hygiene revenue will be lost, the fact that patients have gone much longer between scalings may mean they need more scaling units. So things will be somewhat uncertain until we know how things are ramping up. But the demand for dental services is not dropping long term because we went through COVID. So that suggests revenue should be good in the long run. Many people ask me about the impact of we're in a recession. We're going to be living with that for some time. History does have a fair bit to teach us. You know, we went through, many of you lived through it, a major recession in 2000. What many of us forget, because it was a while ago, is it actually took 3 years for the country to dig its way out of that recession. So the best thing you can do to see the impact of what was a pretty big recession, those of you who own a practice, go back and look at what happened to your revenue. If you're like most of the dentists I was dealing with at the time, your revenue may not have gone down at all, indeed many people. And while that's anecdotal, here's some specific data from 3 provinces where we were able to get access to their RK House data in terms of dental spending per capita. You can see that what I've done in this chart is set 2008 at 100 in terms of dental spending per capita. And the subsequent years are indexed to that. And all 3 of those provinces at no point dipped significantly below the pre-recession levels. Ontario sort of fell back towards that level in 10 and 11. And throughout the whole time, Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan were above. And you know, we've heard from other provinces that don't have their data similar. So, you know, the bottom line is there is all kinds of reason to believe that we'll eventually get back to the kind of revenue levels that we came into COVID. There's a large and growing backlog of patients. Dental revenue is largely deferred, not lost. And the profession's resilient in recession. The big question on earnings is the cost question. The infection protection and control standards, what we need to do with deal with aerosols, are a question that has not been answered yet. We modeled it out, though, with a fairly aggressive assumption. More aggressive, actually, than the European markets that are opening this week or next week in terms of personal protective equipment. The numbers you see on your screen assume that for every patient, you would have to change and put on an N95 mask, not a surgical mask, that you would be using a face shield and a surgical gown that's changed. Depending upon the balance between reusable and disposable items, that could increase cost by 2 to 4% of revenue, which is no small amount. fully aware of that. But that kind of cost increase in most businesses, and I truly believe in dentistry, is recoverable by a fee or pricing. Dentistry has not always been great at that across the country, but you don't need to look any further than the Tim Hortons that you go to or the gas station to see that when the cost of coffee beans go up, it increases the price of a cup of coffee. Gas stations obviously do the same thing with crude oil. So an important factor in the future will be the ability to recover those costs, but we believe that's manageable with the right leadership. So bottom line, little reason to fear long-term erosion. And that that earnings multiple, that's where you've got the laws of supply and demand or economics on your side. COVID cannot repeal the laws of economics. We came into this situation with demand significantly exceeding supply, and there's no reason to believe that. Look at the key drivers of demand. There's still too many dentists and not enough practices. That will be true post-COVID. Interest rates are now down 150 basis points, 1.5%, at some of the lowest levels we've ever seen, making financing costs lower than we've been dealing with recently. That tends to drive up. Sure did after 2008. And there's still a huge pool of investment capital to be deployed by the corporate organizations across Canada who are aggregating. So demand should stay strong, if not stronger, because of the lower finance. Supply may change a bit. Stock market declines have eaten into many owners' retirement plans. So some people may need to work an extra year or two or wait until the stock market comes back to be able to sell their practice. That certainly happened in 2008. And if supply's down and demand's flat to up, you all know what happens. So sort of in conclusion, hey, sales have slowed and stalled, and Michael and Ramal will talk more about that. But history suggests earnings impact may be less than many of you are worried about. Supply and demand is definitely going to come out of this still on the side of practice. And buyers are moving now to get a competitive advantage versus the ones that have moved to the sidelines. I really do believe across the vast majority of future scenarios, long-term prospects for dental practice valuation remain strong. So that's it in terms of prepared comments, and I'll turn it back to you, Scott.
Thank you very much, Bill, for that. I guess there was a few people who commented that your volume wasn't coming through all that well. I don't know, I could hear you okay myself, but one of the questions is, would you be able to make your presentation available that it could be sent out to attendees as well? I think that's in response to the volume possible challenge.
Absolutely, I'd be more than happy to.
Okay. So a couple questions that came in that as an associate who's buying a practice prior to COVID, deal wasn't closed due to COVID. Should I wait a period of time to close or close as soon as possible?
That's a really good question that's very situationally dependent. The benefit of moving forward now is you don't allow somebody else to get in there ahead of you. So if you think it's a competitive practice, you'll want to look at a practice there's a lot of competition for. You'll want to look at how you can secure your position. But there are some uncertainties. I think Michael Kuttner will talk a little bit about how purchasers may want to protect themselves against that.
Okay, thanks for that, Bill. The other another question that came in is, how are specialist practice valuations going to be affected in the next 6 to 12 months, specifically pedo/ortho practices?
If somebody out there can tell me exactly what will happen in the next 6 to 8 months, I'd be more confident in answering a question with that timeline. I was watching Theresa Tam on the TV just before this began, and her comment was, there is no proven path back to the new normal. So what I would say is that for pediatric practices and ortho practices, hey, some of the things I've heard is it'll be easier to return to treating kids than older adults. Certainly aerosolization isn't an issue with ortho practices the way it is with some. So it's possible you'll return to business faster. But the basic principles are the same. I don't think longer term earnings will be impacted. I don't think supply and demand is going to be dramatically impacted. Once we've got a clear sight line forward, that my only hesitation of being more definitive is the specific timeline.
Okay. And I'll give you one more, Bill, before we turn it over to Romel. You spoke of revenue deferral, but shouldn't we consider hygiene revenue as lost revenue, since people will pick back up with their interval of appointments when back to work?
Yeah, and that's a very perceptive comment by whoever made it. In the average practice, hygiene revenue runs around 30 to 35% perhaps of total revenue. And a bunch of that revenue is gone. Pretend it's the only counterbalancing factor is that I was talking to a dentist, actually it was a periodontist, said, oh my goodness, we're going to have a lot more calculus buildup to deal with, and we're going to schedule people for an extra unit their first back. But I think you should expect much of that revenue, but some of it will come back. My comments about deferral were more about.
Okay, thank you for that, Bill. So what we'll do is we'll turn it over to Romel. I'll let you share your screen and enlighten us on the world of banking and what's going on these days.
Thanks, Scott. Let's just make sure this works. I'll put this on.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, I think I am good. And if I can get this going, I apologize, folks. So a couple of disclaimers before we start this. If you hear children screaming in the background, I apologize in advance. I've got a 12 and 11-year-old, so the screaming is not them getting killed, but them beating each other up. They are bored. The other disclaimer, of course, is yes, I am wearing regular jeans and not pajama pants underneath. So let's just get started then. So folks, you've had I guess a basic economics lesson from Bill on practices. You talked about supply and demand, which of course is what drives the value of practices. But there's something in there that he briefly touched base on, and thankfully so, because at least it gives me something to present: the availability of capital. So you've got this nice screenshot here of, it says come in, we're open. And what that means is, listen, banks are open. So some things that you already obviously know. So where are we right now? Of course, economic activity is decreased due to COVID-19, especially for non-essential industries feeling the full impact, folks such as yourselves. Second point, there's uncertainty about the length of the provincial shutdown. So you had a great chat with Michael Kuttner this morning and the folks on the panel about some of the positive trajectory we're seeing in terms of COVID-19 cases and the potential for a staggered approach to the economy opening up in May. Hopefully that does happen. And of course, that bodes well for all of us. Other point, M&A activity, and this is where it's very important for you folks. What we've seen across the financial services sector is that M&A activity and new startups across all sectors have slowed down dramatically since March 1st of this year. And that's, of course, due to the shutdowns, as well as uncertainty about when the economy is going to be opening back up. And finally, the Canadian government, and I don't think we give enough credit to the government as to what they've done. They've stepped up in a big way, as most governments have. They've got few levers to pull. One of them would be, of course, decreased rates, which you guys have benefited from, as prime has gone down by 150 basis points over the last, I want to say, 8 weeks. And two, some of the economic stimulus. So the wage subsidy programs, the deferral on taxes, making capital available through BDC, EDC, and again, the business credit availability program. So what else are we seeing? Most healthcare practices, they're shut down or performing emergency services only. That's a challenge for your revenue, and it makes it a challenge for you to survive. The good news is, and again, this is from a banking perspective, and Bill touched on this, healthcare practices are recession resistant, and they're low risk to the banks. Why is that? Default rates have been historically below 1%. And for context, I'll use Bank of Montreal's default rate. I think our default rate in the last 5 years has been 0.1%. If you contrast that against the general commercial population of 2%, you can see why banks are always jumping all over each other to bank healthcare practices and specifically dentists. So what's going on now? As you all can imagine, banks are still providing financing, but we're using the words, we're being judicious in deploying capital for acquisitions and startups. And you must ask yourself, why is that? Well, to Bill's point earlier on, we just don't know what things are going to look like, post COVID-19 restrictions being lifted. So as a lender, you can imagine, you want to deploy capital in the most risk prudent manner. Some clarity about what happens or what is going to happen is necessary. The other part of this that's really important for you all, and I again, it's lost in this COVID-19 disruption. The financial services sector is backing Canadian businesses in a big way. And how is that? We've been deploying capital to make sure our existing clients have their short-term needs taken care of. So if you recollect some of the actual measures taken by the banks, one, on the personal side, principal and interest payment deferrals on your mortgages, just to make sure, of course, again, on the personal side, you're taken care of. Two, if you're an existing business owner, and it's across all sectors, principal payments are being waived for up to 6 months. We're also increasing your operating lines temporarily to help with the short-term cash flow needs. Again, things to make sure that once the economy opens back up, that businesses are still kept relatively whole and are positioned to succeed coming out of this. So, what do I expect existing owners to do? Simple stuff, folks. Ensure that you have enough liquidity for your practice to endure this disruption. The banks are making it very easy. I've already indicated the financial relief services or programs that are available. These are across all manner of bank. Okay, this is not just BMO specific. This is BMO, RBC, CIBC. We've all come together, again, at the behest of the government to make a concerted effort to offer practice owners, business owners, relief. So you've got number one, taking advantage of the payment principal deferrals, temporary increases of lines of credit. Number two, some of the government measures, and I touched base on this briefly in terms of the capital the government's made available. If you have not applied for the CEBA account, which is an interest-free loan that does not require repayment for 3 years, you are making a mistake. Keep in mind, there are some real good benefits to this product. If you repay $30,000 by December 31st, 2022, there's $10,000 that comes your way. It's a free $10,000, folks, even if you don't need the 40. I would apply as soon as you can. All banks are taking this. The BCAP programs, and that's the business credit availability programs, those are for individuals who have greater financing needs than what could be taken care of by the principal payment deferrals, as well as the CEBA account. Please make sure you reach out to your existing relationship manager if you see that you need additional support. Again, it's there for you. What else are you supposed to be doing? Government programs. It's 2 bullet points. I won't go into every single one in detail. The temporary wage subsidy program, the emergency wage subsidy program, and of course, income tax deferrals. All of these things are meant to help you with your short-term capital. So what's your job? Keep up to date on the government programs. Folks, take advantage. And why is that important? You want to minimize operational disruption in practices. It's easier doing the sale process. I'm sure Bill will tell you, if everything's up and running, as we come out of COVID-19, if you're looking at transitioning out, this makes it quite a bit easier. Now, what do we expect for people who are looking at buying? Simple stuff. This is rudimentary, but sometimes I think it's ignored. Get your financial house in order. Make it easy for banks. Is your credit in good standing? Do you have cash available for your deposit? Those are things you need to think about. I need you guys to assess how much you need to pay your bills and maintain a standard of living that you deem acceptable. Once you've done that, type of practice you're looking for, Buying a practice is a huge decision. It will impact your life. Do some research. You can't just buy a practice without doing research. I know, again, very rudimentary stuff. Understand the demographics of certain regions. And of course, educate yourself on the key performance indicators of practices. The information is out there, folks. Bill will provide it to you. I'm volunteering you, Bill. It's all there. And of course, work with a broker to identify the practice of choice and the right fit. What do we expect from you guys when you come to the bank? Again, a little bit of work required, but I think given what's gone on with COVID-19 and our, let's call it judicious deployment of capital, I think this is essential stuff. Put together a simple business plan. No one's asking you to spend $5,000 and put together a formalized business plan, but at least give the bank some ammunition, or the banker some ammunition when they actually go to the risk department. When you put together a business plan, it helps you formalize your thoughts and the direction you want to take the practice post-purchase, and of course, post-COVID-19. Again, this is helping the bank understand what your managerial acumen is and what the practice is going to look like after closing. What we want to see is that the sponsors or purchasers have some level of liquidity to withstand short-term hiccups. We don't know what recovery looks like right now, folks. It could be U-shape, L-shape, V-shape, W-shape, not remotely sure. So if I were in your shoes, approaching a bank for financing, whether it be an acquisition, startup, whatever it is, making sure that you at least have some liquid assets to withstand some type of, let's call it U-shaped recovery or L-shape, I think is going to be very important. And of course, finally, other documents apply, regular appraisal, purchase and sale, et cetera, et cetera. I've got a nice little sign here that says we're open for business. Okay, folks, banks have not stopped lending. Okay, understand that. We will continue to finance practices that are positive, or cash flow positive, but we just are going to do a little bit more due diligence and ask you to show us a bit more. In the past, I believe, again, because of the healthy dynamics of the healthcare industry, I would say we were a little bit more lenient when it came to requiring information and at least conversation. I think what you're going to see is that your banker is going to want to have a meaningful conversation with you before extending financing. Other than that, folks, again, the financial services industry is open for business, number one. Number two, even if for some reason capital is not available from banks, there's always capital in the streets. Don't forget that. Number three, there's BDC, the Business Development Bank of Canada. There's there as well. So there are any number of avenues available to you to obtain capital if you so need. And with that, Scott, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramon. There was a number of questions around, obviously, will money be available? And I think you covered that off quite nicely. A few good questions here as well, too. I cannot apply for CEBA because I opened a new dental practice in November and I don't meet the payroll criteria. What options do I have?
So, great point. They don't meet the threshold for the prior year. Doesn't mean that you can't at least get your actual principal deferral or your actual, I guess, operating line. Again, you're just looking for short-term capital to get you through this lull. Also, again, if you're looking for capital, I would imagine you're trying to cover payroll costs. That's what the actual Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy Program is for. So I can appreciate they're not every program you're going to qualify for, but there are other avenues to obtain short-term capital to meet your needs.
Thank you for that. Will banks be hesitant to loan a dentist the cost of a dental practice, say $3 million, if the dentist is to finance the entire purchase?
Oh, okay. No, not at all. That doesn't change. Again, there are some very healthy historical dynamics of the dental industry. When it comes to financing, as long as you meet the typical criteria and the practice, again, is cash flow positive, then why would we? Why would we not provide financing? Nothing's going to change, folks, in terms of our assessment of individuals and practices. The anomaly or the variable in all of this is, what recovery looks like, and that's going to, that's going to require us to maybe adapt and maybe change our lending approach. But for the time being, nothing's changed. We're just not, I will say one caveat, we're not closing practices during COVID-19. You're not looking at funding practices during COVID-19. We're looking at funding post restrictions being lifted.
Okay. Of course, I'm sure you always love this question. What is the current interest rate for a line of credit?
It depends, but if you're a dental practitioner, you're probably looking at prime. And again, prime's gone up by about 150 basis points. I feel like I might have overstated that, but it's a significant number. It's very cheap money right now.
Question in regard to what is EDC and BDC?
Both of these are crown corporations. Those are the corporations the government has elected to help deploy the capital to support businesses. If you recollect, I think Prime Minister Trudeau made about $82 or $80 billion available. We've deployed a significant amount to both of these crown corporations for volume purposes. So they're there to help or work with banks in cases where the relief measures that we had in place before don't necessarily help specific borrowers. So if if the principal payment deferrals don't help, if the line of credit increase doesn't help, if the CEBA account doesn't help, then we make an assessment and then we would get either one of these crown corporations involved. And again, this is across the entire financial services industry. It's not Bank of Montreal specific. All banks have come together and said, listen, our job is to really help support Canadian businesses, and that's why these things are broadly available.
Are banks open to re-amortizing to help with debt service?
I think we're not going to have a choice. Truthfully, if I had to think about it, what's the alternative? It is either we help our clients with extending amortizations, or we watch them fail, and in which case puts our capital at risk. So I suspect as we come out of COVID-19 and we assess where practices are at, we're going to see more of those requests, and we'll likely support it now. Obviously, there are caveats to that. I don't know. Each practice is going to be different, but broadly, I wouldn't be surprised if we see folks asking for re-amortizations and banks entertaining them.
Yeah, and I would think that through all this, as things go forward, right, those things all get figured out as to what that looks like and how that plays into it.
Scott, the magic word is fluid.
Fluid, yeah.
It's all fluid.
I've heard that a lot, the word a lot. One more for you before we move to Michael, and from an old buddy of mine. For an acquisition of an existing practice, when reviewing prior year financials and cash flows, what assumptions are you making in terms of projected revenues in the next 12, 24 months in deciding the facility to be granted?
That's a tough one. So a couple things. One, we haven't seen many transactions during the shutdown, so I can't say we have a methodology set yet. For myself, when I've asked my folks to take a look at is assume a 50% decrease in revenues over the, let's call it 3 to 6 months post COVID-19 restrictions being lifted, just to be very conservative, and then work with that. Now, what I've also done, and again, this is just something I've instituted, we've tried to figure out, or we've used a contribution margin approach to break even, factoring in debt servicing requirements to figure out at what level of sales does a practice need to hit to meet its variable costs, its fixed costs, as well as its term loan payments. Now, I know that's very technical stuff, and I can share that stuff later on if folks want to reach out, but that's the way we've kind of done it, and it's helped us with in assessing some practices.
I'll throw you on the spot here. There's one I thought, one more we'll address. Although the banks have offered deferral of payments on mortgages long-term, does this not benefit the banks by adding the deferred interest back onto the principal amount, thus compounding interest on interest? So
I'll give you a very simple answer. Yes, it does benefit the banks, but I don't know what the alternative is. There's no such thing as free money. So we're giving the option to clients to take these deferrals and these increases in lines of credit, but you don't have to. I think the most important thing for the entire financial services industry is to give folks flexibility. Nothing's perfect, and maybe this solution it evolves further if the shutdown is elongated, but for the time being, it is what it is.
Okay, 2 more quick ones.
Sure.
Does real estate equity value count in banks' appraisal of liquid assets of their candidates?
It doesn't count in terms of liquid assets, but it does help us assess your overall net worth, and it bodes well for you. So if you've got equity in real estate, absolutely helps you.
And one final one for you, Romel. What interest rate can you get a practice loan now?
You're probably looking at prime, but again, each circumstance is different. Each client has their own risk profile, but again, I would say broadly across the industry, rates haven't gone up. You're probably looking at the prime lending rate.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for your great info. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
So Michael, we'll turn it over to you, and
Okay.
I'll let you share your screen.
Sure, let me get that screen up there for everyone. So thank you everyone for coming and listening to us. We know this is a difficult situation, especially for dentists. We know practices across Canada, have been closed for a while now. We're going to our 6th week. I know here in Ontario, where I'm based out of, we've received some decent news in the last day or two, and I know our Premier is going to be making further announcements, which maybe will give us some clarity as to how long the shutdown will last. Let me just switch the slide here. There we go. So under law, what we do, essentially, we represent dentists doing corporate work for them. So my day-to-day is buying and selling dental practices, helping dentists start up new practices, although as we've heard, that might become more difficult. Right now, we have about 15 to 20 dental deals on my floor right now that I've been working on. Since COVID started, I've only closed one, and that was on March 31st. There were certain conditions in there that may not have seemed favorable to the selling dentist, but we did get the deal done, and I think it was a fair deal from the buyer seller. I have one more deal, which actually BMO told us today that they will finance during the COVID shutdown, so hopefully that will close during the shutdown. But beyond that, of the 15 to 20 that we're doing, probably 2 or 3 of the purchasers have just walked away. A few have tried to renegotiate price. Seems at this point, and Bill spoke to this, sellers aren't willing to move too much on the price as of yet, and we'll see if that changes. And a lot of the dental practices deals that we're working on have just sort of paused. We're not sure where those are going to go. I haven't heard from some of our clients in a few weeks, and I think some of them are just waiting, both buyer and seller, to see how this shakes out and how long this is going to last. So as a lawyer, you called me three months ago, I would have told you we closed 10 dental deals last month. Anything that could have come up, we've dealt with it. In the last year, maybe we've done 50 or 60 purchase and sales of dental practices in Ontario. You call me today and I'm speaking a very different tune. It's the unknown and uncertainties around these transactions during COVID has made these deals so problematic. From the buyer side, they're nervous. If I enter into an agreement, what am I bound to? What happens if the practice doesn't open for a few months? What happens if revenue never gets back to where it was? So we're dealing with all of those. Right now, and I'll get into one of the biggest challenges, trying to figure out a closing date. That's a big challenge. A lot of dentists are saying, and Bill talked to this, what if there's additional expenses? The purchase price that I paid previously doesn't take those things into account. So we've been changing purchase agreements, deals that had been signed before COVID and that hadn't closed yet. We're going back to those. We're doing amendments to those deals. A lot of times you'll see representations and warranties in your purchase agreements that provide for, since the last financial period, there's been no material changes. Well, I would think COVID-19 and a shutdown of the dental practice would mean a material change to the practice. You'll see material adverse change conditions in these purchase agreements, meaning if there's a material adverse change to the practice, and to me, I think COVID-19 and a shutdown would mean there's been a material adverse change. Does the buyer then have the right to walk away from the transaction? So we have to look at all these different provisions that have been in agreements that were signed before and in new agreements that we're trying to work on. Conditional periods, Ramal can talk to this a little bit later, I guess, but financing. Can you sign a purchase agreement now with a financing period condition for 15 business days after we sign the purchase agreement? That would be standard, meaning you go to the bank would approve the financing. But if banks aren't approving firm approvals during the COVID shutdown, perhaps the financing condition has to start once the COVID restrictions are lifted. So we have to think about all those things so purchasers don't get stuck in deals that don't make sense, frankly. Setting a closing date, this is the biggest question on everyone's mind. If we had a deal that had been signed prior to COVID, the shutdown, the closing dates that we had in there no longer make sense. And then now when we're working on trying to get deals through and trying to at least get the paperwork done, so we're ready for when the restrictions are lifted, how do we pick a closing date? So, I've seen it as simple as 15 business days after practices reopen. Well, then you have to get into the nitty gritty of what does reopen mean? Does that mean all restrictions are lifted? What if and I'm talking from Ontario, so some of what I'm saying, is Ontario-centric. But what if the RCDSO says you're allowed to do certain dental treatment, but you're not allowed to do hygiene? I haven't heard that, but I'm just making that up. That could impact a closing, and would a purchaser want to close if that was the impact of the practice? Others I've seen, well, we need to hit a certain revenue target. So I've seen, once the revenue target hits, let's say $200,000, we'll close within 10 days of that, or maybe an average of the revenue for a certain period. So, lawyers and accountants we're working on trying to figure out what a fair and reasonable closing date may be. Now, I use the word reasonable. I want everyone to keep this in mind. If you do have a deal going on, either purchaser or vendor, these are unprecedented times. Lawyers, accountants, all your advisors, even the dentists, are working to try to figure out what may make sense. But the reality is, until we're 6 months out from this, no one's going to know, what was making sense. It's only hindsight is 2020 that we're going to be able to figure this out. What happens if restrictions are lifted and then we get a second wave of COVID? Practices have to shut down a month after reopening. Anything is possible. So these are the things that keep lawyers up at night. And frankly, purchase agreements really can't account for every single potential possibility. So employee issues, at least in Ontario, a lot of dentists quickly laid off a lot of their employees. In terms of the purchase and acquisition of a dental practice, something that we need to consider. If an employee is laid off, what is the timing of them being rehired after they reopen? What is the liabilities that the vendor purchaser may incur? There's some employee side lawyers that are out there stating that if you didn't lay them off in accordance with the employment agreement, maybe that's constructive dismissal. I don't really follow that line of argument, but there may be litigation after deals close, and then who's responsible for that litigation, regardless of whether that litigation has merit or not. Due diligence and chart reviews. So during COVID, we do have deals that are ongoing, and purchasers are trying to do their due diligence. It is more difficult. You have to go into that practice, and the buyer has to be willing to go in there, and someone has to let them in to do their chart count, to check equipment. You've got to take your numbers into account. As I said before, will the dental colleges require increased IPAC requirements? Will those patients come back? How long will it take for them to come back? So even due diligence is difficult, but we do have transactions where due diligence is moving forward as much as we possibly can. So lease issues. So generally when I give talks to dentists, it's the landlords on these transactions that give the most difficulty in getting the deals closed. Okay. What we're telling buyers and sellers, or sellers who own practices right now, if you cannot afford to pay the rent, try to get the rent deferred. But we need to deal with that in the purchase transaction, who pays for that deferred rent later on. If you can get that $40,000 loan, my preference is you use the $40,000 loan as opposed to going to your landlord, who you're very soon, the purchaser may be asking for amendments to a lease. You want to stay on their good side if you're asking for amendments. They may not be particularly happy giving you that deferment. One other point I want to make, and this is just me thinking out loud, landlords, at least in the Greater Toronto area, have given problems to dentists selling practices. They all want their demolition clause. They all have plans to redevelop. With the slowdown in the economy and the problems commercial real estate may be facing, does that give dentists greater leverage when they're trying to negotiate leases? I don't know what the answer to that is. It's a thought. Rents may come down. Will development plans be pushed out? Potentially. It's something to think about for sure. So dental services organizations, I've talked to other lawyers dealing with them, just like regular dentists, they are still looking at practice transactions. From my understanding, they are going through the necessary steps to close the transaction, but like everyone else, it's unlikely they're going to be closing a transaction during this shutdown. So thank you. I hope everyone stays healthy, and happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Michael. A couple have come in here. My office is closed right now. Would you recommend putting employees on leave with wage subsidies, which will be almost same as what they would get through CERB? What do I benefit from that apart from legal liabilities?
So everything I say is provincial to provincial. So every province has different laws governing that. You've got to go to your lawyer, wherever province you are, to look at your employment contracts, whether you have them or not. Make that determination whether that layoff was allowed under the employment contract. And again, going back to the issue of constructive dismissal, that's it is unlikely that that's going to be a favorable decision in court for the employee, but they may give you issues. Now, if you keep your employees hired and use the 75% wage subsidy, that's going to be, ideal for you. The other risk to you is there's nothing stopping that employee from going to another dental practice. Maybe they get an offer from one of the big corporations. Maybe they just don't want to come back. Who knows? If you're selling your practice, my concern is, we reopen and some of those employees don't come back, then you have a bit of an issue with a purchaser. So, in an ideal world, if you can afford it, you may want to consider, after talking to your lawyer and accountant, bringing them back and using that 75% wage subsidy.
Thanks for that, Michael. A question in regards to being incorporated. I incorporated in September 2019, did not draw any money from corporation in 2019, as I had met my financial requirements for the year forming the corporation. Can I apply for CEBA?
So the rules around CEBA, do limit who can apply for that, and you'd probably be unlikely given under the current rules. I'm still trying to figure out the rules, and I've applied for myself. But Trudeau is coming out with a new announcement every day. There's policy groups that are lobbying the government every day, saying we were left out of certain subsidies, including the $40,000 loan. And so my thoughts, and I've had other clients, I've had clients who purchased a week or two before the shutdown, and it is questionable whether they're even eligible for it, which to me is really unreasonable because they're the ones who need it the most. I have a feeling, and I can't guarantee anything, that the government is going to come out with, and they've already done it, but I think there's going to be even further changes to potentially deal with situations like that where they may not qualify now, but hopefully they'll be able to qualify once further rule changes are made.
What is the best closing condition to protect both buyer and vendor?
Well, most of the conditions aren't to protect the buyer and the vendor, unfortunately. If it was 3 months ago, we wouldn't talk about any conditions, generally to protect the buyer because we were in such a seller's market. But now, given all the uncertainty, we're really starting to think about buyer protecting the buyers. One thing I've seen is holdbacks, which you hadn't seen in the last few years, especially in the Greater Toronto area, because it was a seller's market. So if a seller really is concerned about that revenue coming back to where it was, perhaps you do a holdback of a portion of that purchase price to maybe the practice within the first year has to hit a certain revenue target. If it doesn't, there's a clawback on that from that holdback. So I have seen that. The other problem with waiting for a closing date that maybe 90, 120 days out is, there's an argument to be made that within that first month or two, that's when that dental practice that you may be buying is going to be the busiest. So if let's say you're an associate at the practice and you really want to buy that practice, by waiting the 120 days, yes, you mitigate some of that risk, but you also don't get the upside on perhaps the busiest 3 or 4 months a dental practice may see. So you have to put all those into consideration. You have to look at your own specific circumstance and navigate that and try to put clauses and agreements that work for the purchaser and allow the vendor to be able to sell a practice.
Can I hire back some employees only, reception and assistant, and apply for a wage subsidy program for them only? Or does the CEWS have to be applied to all staff?
That I'm not sure what the rules are on hiring back only some versus others. For that, you'd have to look at the specific circumstance. And frankly, I'd have to do some research into that. I haven't been asked that question, so I can't get into specifics on that one. I don't want to give anyone any wrong information.
Yeah, not a problem. And understood. What have landlords been doing with rent? Just what have you seen?
So a lot of landlords have been deferring. I haven't seen any abatements. So deferring, what they'll do is they may say April and May's rent, you're not going to pay it in April and May. We're going to defer that and we're going to amortize that over the remaining term of your lease. So you're not saving any money from what I've seen. There's probably some landlords that are abating, it's probably smaller landlords. Some landlords won't do anything. They won't, at least for April rent, some of the bigger ones won't do it. Some of the bigger ones will do. So it all depends on landlord to landlord, but generally it is a deferral of your rent and then amortizing it over the remaining term. So you're going to be paying a higher rent for the remainder of your term.
And I know this is more around employment law, so sorry for this, Michael, but I'll ask. If my staff are laid off for 13 weeks, should I be concerned about paying termination pay? How should I negotiate around this?
Okay, so I've had conversations with employment lawyers who deal with this. So there are certain conditions at least in the Employment Standards Act, Ontario, which can increase that 13 weeks if certain conditions are met. There's also a thought, and there's been different areas of the law that have already been changed because of COVID, and they may be temporary. But the thought is if this actually goes longer than 13 weeks, so let's say the Government Emergency Act, goes for 15 weeks, 16 weeks, there's thoughts that there may be amendments to the Employment Standards Act in each province that may extend that. So it's a wait and see approach. We're not there yet. And so as we get closer to that, more information may come about. But yes, I've heard that question. And I think that the government would have to make certain amendments.
So if one other question came in here for you, Michael, as well too.
Sure.
Specific legal issues that you expect to encounter going forward with deals?
So litigation, I think, anytime there's a recession or uncertainty, litigation arises. And that's sort of why in my presentation, I think other lawyers I've talked to, I'm hopeful that everyone is reasonable. I think if things go to litigation, and courts may look, let's say a purchaser wasn't willing to close for a certain reason. Let's say before the COVID shutdown, they had waived their financing condition. And then COVID happens, and I've actually heard of this happening, not with BMO, but another bank, where the bank will just say, we are not funding during the shutdown, and there's no other conditions remaining. So if you look technically under the letter of the law, that purchaser is in default of their agreement. Now, how does a court look at that if it would ever go to litigation? Maybe they don't look that friendly at a vendor who's really holding a purchaser to that agreement. If that purchaser is completely going to walk away from the deal, that's one thing. They're saying, well, let's just extend till the COVID restrictions are lifted. I think everyone should be working reasonably with each other. I think it's the unknowns where things are going to come into effect. I think once we open up and we see what sort of restrictions are still in place on dental practices and the timing of the closings, I think there's going to be some dispute on that. So I'm trying to be very careful, and I think other lawyers are trying to be very careful on the wording they're putting about reopening of the practices and when those closings may happen.
And this, any particular recommendations for new graduates with respect to associate agreements, et cetera?
Yeah, associates are in a problematic situation, not really on the agreement side, but in terms of when they come back from COVID, and what I've heard from dentists, and a lot of dental brokers are saying this, and associates frankly are worried that there's, as the work comes in and as the principals want to make up revenue that they've lost, there'll be less work for the associates. In an associate agreement, it's very rare that you're going to see work guarantees in those associate agreements. Maybe you can start considering that. I don't know if principals are going to be agreeing to put anything in writing about how many patients an associate may see when we reopen. Sort of doubtful of that. But before you sign any associate agreement, get your lawyer to look at it. And we may be looking at these agreements in a new light given the situation with COVID and how that may impact the practice.
What do you propose regarding deals in letter of intent stage? Is it reasonable time to proceed to a share purchase stage?
So my answer now is a lot different than it was a month ago because we're a month closer to reopening. So, let's just look at a tier 3 transaction. So tier 3 will sign their letter of intent, and then from there you'll have 2 to 3 weeks to do some due diligence. So, let's say you sign the letter of intent today, now you have 2 or 3 weeks to do your due diligence, and then you may have another 2 weeks for your lawyer to draft the purchase agreement. So already we're at 5 to 6 weeks away from today's date, and we may be open by then, right? Or we may have a lot more clarity at that point. So I wouldn't say there's an issue with going into a non-binding letter of intent. Remember the key word there, non-binding. It's going to allow you to at least to start negotiating, start doing your due diligence, at least having that, moving things forward. And we may have clarity by the time that purchase agreement is done. So there's no reason you shouldn't be able to work on a purchase agreement. And a lot of these issues that I've said around closing dates and holdbacks and all that, maybe we have enough clarity at that point that we can put some definitive terms in there, or we may not even need some of these terms in there at that point.
And Scott, just let me add to that, the choice everyone will need to make is, if you aren't comfortable moving forward with a letter of intent, will other people be moving forward? And certainly that's what we've seen. We've seen some people back off entirely, but then we've seen other ones who are concerned about their ability to get a practice, realize they've got a competitive advantage forward on the basis pretty much that Mike's talking.
Yeah, I think it also depends on who you are, where you are in your career. If you're a dentist who owns a practice already or multiple practices, you may be less risk averse and more aggressive about buying and entering into a letter of intent right now. If this is your first practice and you only intend to own one practice going forward, maybe for you, the right answer is to wait 6 months to a year and see how this all plays out, rather than get into a position where, it may not work out 100% as you planned. You didn't have the, you didn't know where it was going. And in a year, we may have, hopefully we'll have a better idea where practice revenues are, and you can buy with the prices may be more expensive then, but at least you have the a better idea of what you're buying, right?
Right, well said. So I'm just going to jump around with a few questions that came up and as along general themes, if everybody's still good for a couple more minutes. I think we are. Bill, for you, PPE was mentioned a number of times in the Q&A, and how you see that affecting the price of the practice overall.
That's very much going to be dependent upon what the new standards become. And it goes back to the comment I made in my presentation about the value of the practice is a function of the earnings of the practice. So if PPE costs go up and cannot be recovered with pricing, then that will negatively impact practice values. But if they go up and can be recovered, then obviously the analysis we've done, if we're just talking N95 masks, gowns, and face shields, those are over a year or two recoverable costs with fee guide increases. And in that case, earnings aren't down. So I think we need to see what the new standards are before we know for sure. And let me just go back and address one question you had about landlords, because we have had some recent experience with landlords. And we've got clients right now who are renegotiating their leases on more favorable terms than they ever would have dreamed of. And it's back to Ramal's point that default rates amongst dental practices are the lowest of any business. And as panicked as many dentists are about their business, imagine being a landlord. And when you go to the landlord and say, look, I'm not sure the convenience store beside me or the restaurant on the other side of the plaza is going to, but I will. But I want to talk about the conditions going forward. We've seen some people get things happening there that we've not seen in a while. So don't omit that from your business. Sorry. But
okay, thank you, Bill. And I guess the other question, Bill, I'll ask you because it came up a number of times as well too, was, and I know you don't have a crystal ball, so this is a hard one, but do you see the market becoming a a buyer's market more so than a seller's market?
That will vary a bit regionally, but in the major urban centers, I think I've got a pretty good crystal ball on this one. Absolutely not. We had a practice, one of those 12 that I was talking where we received 25 offers, another one where we received 12. So yeah, even if a number of buyers step to the sideline, the notion that it will change in any fundamental way simply is not realistic. As soon as we've got a good sense of how practices get back, if somebody is in, and this happens occasionally due to either lease issues or personal finance or health issues, have to proceed with a sale urgently right now, yeah, it's the balance is shifted. But once we're back to business and dental practices, none of the supply-demand dynamics suggests that it's going to be anything other than a seller's market.
Okay, thank you for that, Bill. Yeah, there's a number of questions about PPE and I guess being from, I guess, the supply or distribution side of our industry. A lot of that's yet to be determined, right? So it's hard to predict, and I see there's some questions about negative pressure rooms and things like that until really the governing bodies come out with, what needs to be done. Obviously that at that time, once that's understood by everybody, on this call, obviously all those things will be taken into consideration when buying and selling goes to happen, would be my comment to that. And it, again, it's going to take a little while to play out as well too. I don't think it's going to be something that happens, in the next week, if you will, because there's lots surrounding that. And obviously everybody wants to know as we see other parts of the world start to open back up, if you will, but we're obviously a little bit further behind, but had more time on the front end. So Ramal, the big question for you that was going through all the Q&A was people just want to know they can get money. Like that's what they were asking. And they asked it in many different ways.
Yes. I've been trying to answer some of the actual questions on chat. Some of the questions were on wage subsidies, the CABA program. Again, folks, if you're not hearing me loud and clear, banks are making capital available. Are we going to be closing transactions during COVID? Likely not. Are we going to be closing transactions the post-COVID restrictions being lifted? Absolutely so. We are in the business of providing capital and getting a return on that. So what does that mean? Money will be made available. Okay. Are we going to be more judicious? Probably. Are we going to ask you to do a little bit of work as you're applying for loans? Probably, but it doesn't stop the flow of capital. Okay.
Right. Thank you for that. And Michael, one more for you as well. Practice sale has been stalled due to the shutdown. There's a clause in the LOI in which the final purchase price will be adjusted after the first 12 months after closing, depending on production/costs. This is likely going to be problematic. Is there any other way around this?
It is problematic in the sense that calculating that and getting everyone to agree on what the calculations is going to be will be difficult. It's just really important to make sure in the purchase agreement you really have guidelines and factors to meet the calculation, so that when you get to the year period after this your closing, there's not going to be, you're going to limit the arguments and potential for litigation at that point. So it's really important for, and I'd even put an illustrative example attached to the purchase agreement of saying, these are the expenses, these are the revenue, here's what our targets were, here's in that sample, here's what the purchase price would have been, so that later on it'd be difficult for either party to argue that we didn't have the guidelines in place to be able to come to a conclusion on the final purchase price.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, with that, we'll wrap things up. There was obviously a lot of interest in today's session for a number of reasons, and people just want to understand what's going on, and maybe it'll be good for us to jump back on in a couple weeks, just to bring everybody up to speed what we're seeing in regards to with a little bit more time passed by, if you will. I think that wouldn't be a bad idea if you're all up for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I'd be happy to do that with the better audio.
Yeah, we'll get you fixed up. Yeah, and if there is any questions specific to Bill Ramal or to Michael, please feel free to reach out to them. They'll be happy to help. You can also reach out to your local Shine representative. They're going to have all their contact information, and already do, so that they can be of assistance and help through this this different time, if you will. And with that said, thank you, gentlemen, for your time, for your insight, for your input, and very greatly appreciated. And for those of you in the audience, we will have sessions like this weekly going forward. Next week, we get a treat. We actually have Dr. John Molinari, who will be speaking along the lines of infection control, with a number of other special guests coming up in the month of May as well, too. So talk to your local representative. They'll fill you in on the information. And if there's anything we can be of assistance with, please feel free to let us know. And on that note, thank you very much to everybody on the call.
No, thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye
Peace.
all.